Hi, I'm Tanis McDonald, and this is Watershed Writers. And I'm very pleased to welcome our first guest on Watershed Writers, who is novelist and poet, Erin Bow. Welcome, Erin.
Well, thank you, Tanis. I'm so delighted that you picked me.
And I should go no further before I congratulate you on winning the Governor General's Award for your middle grade novel, Stand on the Sky. Now, this was in 2018, am I right?
2019.
2019.
Snuck in there before the pandemic.
That's right. And that's the last time I saw you, too, was at the Wild Writers Festival.
Yeah, well,
year.
Approximately the last time I left my home.
Book promotion during pandemic restrictions is really something.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wanted to talk about Stand on the Sky first. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of other books and your poetry. We're going to have quite a large discussion, quite a far-ranging discussion.
Okay.
But the very first thing I want to know about is the birds. Stand on the Sky takes place in a Kazakh region of Mongolia. And of course, these are people who hunt with eagles. And so eagles and large raptors are very much a part of this book. So tell me about what it's like to be that close to eagles when they're small and when they're adult-sized.
Eagles are really, really quite amazing. I have been obsessed with birds of prey most of my life. And I have been brewing this book about a child and a bird of prey for a long time. But to actually go to Mongolia and to live with a family that keeps eagles was an incredible experience. When we got there, there was an eagle that had just been taken from its nest, which means it's fairly close to full size, but not feathered out yet. And then over the 6 weeks or so that we stayed there with this family, the eagle slowly grew in its feathers and learned to make these adjustments with its wings. You could see it, like figuring out the wind slowly. And we were there the first day that Alambai, the eagle hunter, his son had caught a rabbit, I'm not quite sure how. And they tied the rabbit to the end of a leash, and the eagle, which has never hunted anything before, ever, is sitting on Allenby's wrist with a hood over its eyes, and you flick off the hood, and there's this lightning strike moment. It zoomed in on that rabbit in a heartbeat, and it was just there. They can move at 150, 200 miles an hour in a dive.
Wow.
50 in a level flight.
Yeah.
And they're big. They're a flying eagle in its first year is maybe 12 pounds, up to 14 or so.
So the velocity of that weight hitting something is
something.
Yeah, it's formidable.
Allenby had an eagle with, and also in addition to the little eagle, he had a grown-up eagle that had a claw that was all bent up from tangling with a wolf, a detail that I actually put in the story. So these eagles can hunt deer and wolves. They usually don't. They usually hunt rabbits and foxes, but they are formidable beasties. Their claws are like this long. The older one, the 6-year-old one, just Allenby's like, oh, this is the best eagle I've ever had. And it kept looking at him like, as soon as I get a chance, I'm going for your eyes. It's just, it was just barely contained.
Wow.
Incredible.
Wow.
Incredible animals.
So this was a huge research piece for this book, was your trip to Mongolia and the time you spent there with a Kazakh family.
Absolutely.
And learning not only about hunting with eagles, but of course about many more things about their culture, about how it's structured, about how their days are structured, and including some chores that I understand that you had to do in order to understand what a young woman like your protagonist, Isulu, what she would do with her day and the kinds of skills that she would develop.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell me a little bit about the chores?
I do have this one friend who has visited 31 countries and performed with the South Korean circus and been adopted by Bushmen and things like that. So I'm like, Shannon, you're a photographer and you've been to places. If I hire you and buy your ticket, would you like to come with me to Mongolia? So she and I went together. They and I went together, new pronoun for Shannon. And we asked the family that we were staying with to treat us not as honored guests, although there's a certain amount of that in any hospitality culture like the Kazakhs, but like 12-year-old girls from their own community, like we were cousins from the next village over. And they tried, but it turns out we don't have any of the skills it takes to be a Kazakh woman. I mean, they kind of looked at us and they're like, these people, they can't milk anything. They're gonna die when the cold winter comes. Because for girls and for women, life is basically about milk. In the summer, the Kazakh nomads eat cheese and butter and a milk tea made with salt. They make noodles, and because we were honored guests, they slaughtered a goat, so we had a little bit of meat. But basically, that's it. Just cheese and milk all summer long, putting on winter weight. And of course, there's no refrigeration. So every day you need to milk everything and then process all the milk. So you get up at dawn and you milk the cows and the yaks. There are horses, they milk horses 5 times a day, which I was not allowed to do, which is fine. The horses are very skittish about being milked. And then there are about 350 goats that go out with the boys every morning and come back in the evening, and then you separate them out and milk them.
I have to say that I wasn't surprised, of course, that the goats were milked, and I wasn't surprised that the yaks were milked, but I was surprised that the horses were milked. That was a moment of learning for me reading this book. I thought, wow.
The horse milk is the only milk that's kept separately. Everything else kind of goes into one big skin, one big urn. But the horse milk is kept separately, and it's fermented into a drink called kumis. It's a little bit like maybe kefir. It's kind of a yogurty thing, but it's warm and bubbly and about 3% alcohol. And it's also their only source of vitamin C. Right?
So yeah, so everyone's got to.
So everyone has to drink kumis or they'd be ill.
Yeah.
So it's culturally a very important signifier drink. So if you go to Mongolia, whether you want to or not, you need to try the kumis. I actually like it. I'm told most people don't. You need to go, you need to try it, and you need to be nice about it because it's important.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about Aysulu, because I think she's such an intriguing character, so determined, so smart, and of course what she has to do in some ways is upend some of these traditions, certainly not all of them, but the kind of tradition that says that only men can hunt with eagles. But there's a significant moment in the story is when some of the women, or one of the older women, says women have always hunted with eagles. And gives Aysulu the kind of motivation, that extra piece of motivation to move forward. And I was interested in what you were doing with the kind of gender discussion you were having there. And even the eagle too undergoes a kind of gender switch, right, in it. And I thought that was intriguing as well. So I wanted to hear a little bit, about your work with gender divisions here and the challenges that brought to this book, which I think it's part of the pleasure of reading it, but I also think it means certainly writing with a certain amount of respect and a certain amount of innovation at the same time.
When I went to Mongolia, I was already brewing a book about a boy and a hawk, actually, and I didn't really intend to make the protagonist a girl. But when I got there, first of all, the young woman that we hired as a guide she was born in a Kazakh nomad family and then went off to Ulaanbaatar for a university degree, and her degree is in gender studies. So she has a lot to say, or had a lot to say, about gender roles in the Kazakh nomad communities. And then of course I was traveling away from my own children, who were pretty small at the time. And I fell head over heels in love with one of the children of the community of the Al, as it's called, whose name was Kumsai, and she was 8. which is the same age as my daughter, Eleanor, was at the time. Eleanor was 8, and they were a lot alike. They were just this brilliant, inward-going, mathematical mind. Like Kumsai they have a dice game they play with ankle bones. She taught me to play it so that she could wipe me out every evening. Just wipe the floor with me. Shannon taught her origami, and she just took to that. She's just clearly a bright spark with probably pretty limited future. If she chose to stay among the nomads, that's hard because that way of life is getting harder and harder as the climate changes. The winters in Mongolia are becoming much fiercer and drier, and the herders are beginning to lose big portions of their livestock. It's a major pressure on their society. So that way of life is a little bit closed. And then families will have 5, 8 children and pick 2 of them to go to university simply because that's what's affordable. And unless you go all the way to the National University, which is 2,000 miles away and in a different language, the only thing you can really do is teach or be a shopkeeper. So I looked at this girl who was just so brilliant and so striving and so warm and so supportive of her family and proud of her traditions and just a brilliant young person, and wondered what her future would be. So Kumsai is not Aislu, and Aislu is not Kumsai. Aislu isn't anyone real. She's a fictional person. But I think it was Kumsai that made me choose a girl. And of course, it's really happening too. There are a handful of new Kazakh eagle hunters. This generation has been passed down for maybe 12, 15 generations as something that only men do. Before that, it was something that women did. And before that again, it was something that everybody did. And then we go back into the myths of prehistory. So for 12 or so generations, there have been only men, but now there are a handful of girls. And it's becoming really, Tansaya, my guide, says that it's been really inspiring to the young women of the nomad community to pick up this thing that is the most prestigious thing, the thing with the highest visibility among the culture, and that it's starting to change the distinction between men's work and women's work and girls' work and boys' work from this one particular point. So
I think this would be a great time to hear you read a bit from Stand on the Sky.
Oh,
and
excellent.
Give us a little flavor of what you've just been talking about.
Oh, I would love to. So Aislu, my protagonist, I get to show off the cover. This is not the one with the Governor General's seal on it, but the Governor General's seal does exist. I just want to make that point. Aislu, my protagonist, in the opening scene, she's with her brother, Sarek, and her brother has been concealing a limp and is really angry about it. Like, he's very frightened that he's going to lose his role in the nomad community because it's a very difficult place to have any kind of physical handicap. It's socially very disabling. So he's been hiding it. And one of the things he does to try to get over it is try to capture an eagle. And that effort goes wrong. And the eagle is killed, and Sarek breaks his leg and is whisked away to a faraway hospital. They think there's something really wrong, and there is. He turns out to have a bone cancer. But in this part, Aislu has just rescued the eagle that they've left orphaned. And of course, she's thinking about her brother. And she's gone to her rather odd auntie, who's sometimes called the foxwife and sometimes called by her name, which is Karakatkis, to get some help to raise this tiny baby eagle that's not doing so well, that she's brought back to her camp. And they've just been out to catch mice. When they came back with the mice, the motherless eaglet was asleep, but not dead. His whole body seemed to heave with his breath. He looked so fragile. Aislu put one finger on the soft down of the eaglet's head, but he did not stir. "Hello, little," she coaxed. "We brought you food." "Split it open," said the foxwife, handing Aislu a mouse and a knife. That's what his mother would do while he's small, and he is weak. Split it and give him the heart. Iceloo felt her lips move and her nose tighten up. Taking care of an eaglet involved more stickiness and crunching stuff than she had imagined, but she would not let it die. She opened the mouth's skin as if it had a zipper and peeled it back from the tiny ribs. She plucked out the heart, little as a knot in yarn, and put it on her fingertip, and she eased the heart into the eaglet's limp beak. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the beak quivered and closed over the mouse heart. The foxwife handed her a long splinter of wood, and using this, Iceloo fed the eaglet bits of mice, scrap by scrap, livers smaller than pinky nails and grass-thin bones. And slowly the eaglet woke up. Strength came into him, like butter forming in a churn. He got his splayed legs under him. He extended his funny long neck, so long he looked like a tiny sock puppet, and started to snap at the food. And when he had finished the third mouse, he looked up at Iceloo. His eyes were dark, dark brown like hers, and bright like hers, like water that moves quickly. Those eyes looked at Iceloo as if she were taller than the sky and twice as beautiful. Iceloo stroked one finger down the softness of the eagle's back. Toktar, she breathed. Toktar meant, he will live, and it was the eaglet's name. Only later did she think about her brother and the blue truck vanishing into the plume of dust and distance.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's so, hearing you read from it reminds me of how physical a book this is. Certainly because it's about what it takes for a very young animal, a young bird to live, to be raised. Of course, the murders of the mice and the 4-year-old girl who murders all the mice, which is a great moment. But of course, and all of the physicality, of course, of the Kazakh nomad society, where you work all day, and of course riding the horse and the training she undergoes to hunt with eagles, and I was so anyway, sorry. I'm just in awe.
Sorry.
Oh yes. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about that is this idea of having permission to write about a community that isn't one's own. And I know there have been lots of stories in recent years about people who didn't have permission to write about a community, but you went there, you spent time with it, with the Kazakh people, particularly with one Kazakh family. And you've talked about how you were very attached to that 8-year-old. I'm interested in what kind of position that story and story leaving the community in this way had for the Kazakh people with whom you worked.
Yeah, the Kazakh people do not take this amiss. They are very happy to welcome outsiders. There's a little bit of concern about the tourist economy and people coming in to view the Eagle Festival specifically, and the way that that's changing the nature of the eagle hunting, which has a very important role in the society. Because the festival is really just a side note. Eagle hunting is about hunting. And the fox furs and the relationship between the hunter and the eagle. And, it would be like, I don't know, confusing the Olympics with a university. They're two different things. And so for a middle grade book, my book actually contains a fair amount of critique of the tourist economy.
Yes, an eagle being displayed on the side of the road. And I very much got the idea that this was not actually a traditional practice, or B, a practice that was a good use of an eagle.
Yes, and the Kazakh eagle hunters that I talk to feel that way. They are opposed to, this sort of direct exploitation of the eagles, but also very proud of their tradition and very happy to share it off. I mean, it's a long and complicated question. I don't think, as white Westerners, it's not our role to decide for other cultures which things they are protective of. But nevertheless, indeed. I think we should approach these things with care you know, and there are a lot of, it's a long conversation. There's cultural appropriation, which is taking something that's important to the culture, stripping it of its context and using it somewhere else. And I have to admit, there was a while when I was drafting this book going, this would turn out so much more commercial and get me in so much less trouble if it was the same story, but with eagle-sized dragons.
And, you know, I thought actually of, you know, in that moment when you're describing the bonding between Tuktar and Isolu, I thought of Anne McCaffrey's Dragon's Dawn.
Oh, did you?
Right,
oh.
right.
Yeah,
which is not to say they're doing the same thing, but it was that moment, that bonding between
that bonding moment.
The two species,
she does
right?
it well. She does it well. Yeah.
And so, I mean, clearly you have something very different going on here, but I think it's interesting that you brought up dragons as
so that is cultural appropriation, right?
Yeah.
That is taking something significant to their culture, stripping it of its context, and using it commercially in your own context, like putting a bendy dot on as makeup.
Yeah.
Not a great idea. You know, on the other hand, there are beautiful things from cultures that people are happy to share, but their culture is also at a point of transition. You know, it's the global warming. I asked Tansai about this directly. I'm like, is this a bad thing? The tourism, the pressure to urbanize, what are the pressures on these traditional societies? And her answer was unequivocal, it's global warming. It's the shift in the climate. You know, so they're part of the world. They're not a little thing that we need to protect and keep in a museum. Again, you know, one of the boundaries one draws around stories is the secret and the sacred. This is neither a secret nor a sacred story. Like, as I was raised Catholic, and I haven't recovered, but I am trying to reupholster a little bit. You know, so like angels in YA fantasy make me a little uncomfortable. I'm like, oh, no. You know, it's a sacred story and I don't like seeing it in that context. But this is not a sacred story. The other question one can raise is own voices. Like, should a white person have written this book at all? And I think unless we can get a Kazakh nomad to write a book and weigh in on that, that's not an answerable question. What I've always come down to personally is two basic rules. First, don't take somebody else's space on the shelf. So I will not be writing like a book about Black people living in New York because there are Black people living in New York who should write that book, right? I will not be writing a book about a trans character because trans people should be writing those books and they should have that space on the shelf and I should not get in their way. So don't take someone's space on the shelf, and then don't use someone else's pain as your ink. You know, if there's a story that is a deep, painful, important story, like say slavery in the Americas, that's not my pain and it shouldn't be my ink. But I am a great believer in having diverse casts and in drawing from traditions all over the world. And, you know, it's a complicated conversation. It's a point of real inflection and friction and conflict in the children's literature community right now, which I think is just growing pains. We need to do better.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. That's true of all genres, right? I can't point to a literary community that I think has gotten it, you know, perfectly correct. You know, I think that we can say this is true of Canadian literature as well, right? All Canadian literature.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me a little bit about what your aims are when you're writing like a middle grade novel? What have some young readers' reactions been to your books?
Oh, I love hearing from young readers. They're just the best. What's interesting about reading, getting mail from young readers is seeing it through the lens that they take from it, which is often a very narrow lens. Plain Kate, my first book, is a Russian-inspired fantasy with a talking cat in it. It's about the witch hunts. It's very dark. There's a lot of blood magic. It's basically me working out the rules of grief. And the mail I get from 8-year-olds is like, oh, I loved the cat. Do you love cats? I have a cat. Does your cat talk? I think all cats can talk. They just don't find us worthy. I'm like, you're absolutely right about that, child. I don't know why you're reading this book. It would have scared me to death. But yeah, they're lovely. They pick up on particular things and really seize on them and make them part of their own heart in a way that most adult readers don't.
I was that kid. I was totally that kid who was passionate about the books that I read and would reread them over and over again. So I think it's a real value for young readers, right? To either see part of their world reflected, the talking cat, right? Or of course things that are fantastic that they might wish were true, or of course, as you point out, the very scary. I was scared in Plain Kate. I was very scared in Plain Kate when I was reading it. And as a reader, I faked myself out because I read Stand on the Sky first. And so I faked myself out thinking, and this will be not the same book, but it might have the same, some of the same things. And then there's lots in Plain Kate that's quite violent. I'm glad you used the phrase blood magic, because there's that, but there's like deep manipulation too, on behalf of some of the characters, because people really want some things to get done and they don't care who's in their way, right? So it's interesting that the young readers are all about the talking cat, which I confess I was too. I love that talking cat and kept looking over at my own cat saying, and where's your witty Oscar Wilde-like conversation? But I was also, really taken aback by the violence. And I feared for that young woman a lot of the time in a way that I didn't fear for Aisalou, despite the fact that Aisalou puts herself in all kinds of danger. But I also get that she's a trained athlete and that she, that
she's
she chooses
supported
it
by her family and her community in a way that Kate is not. Kate is an outcast and an outsider.
And she's very alone for much of the book.
She lived a precarious existence, and then her father dies, and then the town turns on her, and all the supports of her existence are kicked away. So she's a very vulnerable person in a very violent time. So yeah, I hope that the violence isn't gratuitous, but it certainly does have extremely dark moments. And the villain is creepy.
He's super creepy. Super creepy. She witnesses a lot of violence too. Kate witnesses a lot of violence and is also the victim of some of it as well. And how do you approach working with that violence in a novel, particularly a novel for younger readers, especially when the victims of the violence are young women? Yeah.
You will notice that none of the violence in this comes to her because she's a young woman. I mean, it's not sexualized.
Right.
She is of lower status, but none of that is related to her gender very much. That is kind of just personally, I don't like that, especially for very young readers. But I can't remember who said it, that it's okay to take young readers to a dark place as long as you don't leave them there.
I've heard that too. I don't know who said it.
I don't know who said that. I love the quote. I've tried to find it, but I haven't found it. Or Chesterton, who says that fairy tales don't tell children that dragons exist. They tell them dragons can be beaten. Right? So I think it's okay to have these, I think it bothers adults a lot more than it bothers children, frankly, to have these darker themes and these adventures and the sense of danger, because children, I think, genuinely do feel themselves often, and sometimes are, in real danger that they simply can't get out of.
Yeah.
And it's nice, I think it's nice is such a small word. It's healing and hopeful to have protagonists in books who also face down these big things, and come out on the other side. There are not many children's books where the protagonist does not come out on the other side. And the ones I have read, I haven't been a huge fan of. I'm just like, ooh, That can be in the adult space. A true dystopian like 1984 is very rare in the children's space.
Yeah. I think it's interesting if we're comparing this to what we've come to think of as traditional fairy tales, which in this culture is usually, in Western culture, we usually think of the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen, although, of course, we can debate whether those are true fairy tales as well. But if we're talking about those kinds of stories, adults often forget that it begins with children in peril. It begins with children, with sometimes with an adult who does not love them, with an adult who plots to get rid of them, with them being lost in the woods, and these kinds of things that, as you say, are what many children deal with every day. And can't escape from. So, I mean, is it Bruno Bettelheim who talks about the whole idea of telling stories is telling fairy tales is to bring to life the violence that children know every day, right? The kind of psychological violence that they know every day.
Like Hansel and Gretel aren't just lost in the woods. They're abandoned in the woods because their parents are starving. Right? These stories are much darker than we remember them being. Much darker. Yeah. Than, because they've been filtered through this layer of Disney, and then this impulse in the beginning of the late 19th century to balderize them and clean them up and give them happy endings.
And that's as adults, we remember the happy endings. We don't remember the fact that it begins with a child in peril, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're really dark. And of course, Plain Kate is kind of Russian. And I kind of like that. The thing I did immediately before reading Plain Kate was read a 500-page volume of Russian folktales, the Pantheon collection of Russian folktales. So a lot of the darkness that comes in there is sort of inherited from that. And the sense of strangeness that, as someone who raised on the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen and the child ballads, it's just over the edge of the map. The way the Celtic ones are slightly weird and unfamiliar, the Russian ones are slightly weird and unfamiliar. And they have a lot of shadows that eat people. And
yeah, I read David Demchuk's The Bone Mother last year, and I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't, but it's on my list.
Yeah, it's just full of these Ukrainian horror figures that are traditional, and some of it made my hair stand on end, both because it was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I'm from Winnipeg, where Ukrainian culture is very strong. In fact, we even have a dance troupe called the Rusalka Dancers. And I was very interested in your use of the mythical figure of the Rusalka, and her part in the blood magic. And I think I want to have you talk a little bit about your choice to use that figure, and some of the ways that you employed it as a figure of loss and grief.
The Rusalka actually came late to my story. I was I got to the end of part one. I always have in a story something I call the original equipment, which is a little bit more than an idea and a little bit less than a premise. And in this case, it's like this girl, and she's forced to sell her shadow, and she gains a talking cat, which is the plot of Act 1. And I got to the end of that, and I'm like, well, now what? She's got a talking cat and no shadow and a witch craze, which is a lot for a plot. I gave it to a friend, Noelle Allen, who's the editor at Woolsack and Wynn. I think you probably know her work. And she's like, "This is my publisher, so yeah." you need to put a Rusalka in it, and I'm like, "What's a Rusalka?"
Wow.
Yeah. So I think she said it as a one-off because it's one of her favorites. So a Rusalka is a ghost figure. Specifically, it's the ghost of a woman who's been murdered. And in some accounts of this, a Rusalka's fate can be undone by avenging her death. And so that becomes the villain's motivation and his through line in the story. So it's why he wants Kate's shadow and why he's doing what he's doing, and the manipulation behind the landscape. It kind of gives you the piece of the plot that's not driven by Kate's choices, are driven by what he wants to do too. So the Rusalka, the dead Rusalka, whose name is Lenore, is his sister. And he wants to first sort of keep it fed so that it doesn't dissolve or go mad or kill everyone or whatever it is that's going to happen, clearly not good. So he wants to keep it fed with this blood magic, which is really quite frightening. And also he wants to avenge this woman's fate. So, which eventually involves taking it out on an entire city. Not of nice people, but still.
Indeed. And it's bone chilling. So I would say that in some ways it's not a book for the faint of heart, except, there are young readers.
They attached to the talking cat. It's actually shelved over in the YA section. So it's shelved for readers. It's odd which ones get shelved where. So yeah, and I didn't think about where it was going to get shelved or who its reader was when I was writing it. It was my first book. I wrote it for me.
I hear that your first child wasn't a very good sleeper in their early years, and that you spent some time driving around southwestern Ontario trying to get them to sleep, and wrote part of the book that way.
That's true, but okay. I started it. It's how I finished it. My older child, they had colic when they were little. The only way we could get them to sleep was to drive around. Like, they would sleep if they were in their car seat. Just this beautiful little drowsy head. Looks so innocent, but just screaming weasel. Oh my Lord. So yeah, we drove a lot, and I finished this book in the front seat of the car. But I started it on an airplane before I had kids, taking off out of the fog in Moncton. And I just read this big set of Russian fairy tales, and I was thinking about them. I just talked to my dad, who is a carpenter, a woodworker, the way Kate is in my story, and her father is in my story. And I was taking off out of the fog, and the plane left its shadow on the fog and pulled away from its shadow, is the way nothing earthbound ever does. Pulls away from its shadow, and the shadow kind of thins out and warps and gets thinner and stranger and bigger and loses the shape of the plane, and then it's gone. And I looked at that, and it's such a fairy tale image. It's so Russian. And into my head waltzed this character who was going to sell her shadow. And she's a wood carver and the daughter of a wood carver. It's got this Russian setting, and it's about shadows and loss. And I wrote the first chapter on the plane, and I can't tell you where it came from, except that that's when it came.
That question that beginner writers often ask, which is, how do you get your ideas? And one of my answers to young writers when they ask is, you get ideas all the time, but what a writer does is recognize what an idea is.
Yeah.
And put time into writing it down, right? So, I always love hearing these kinds of generative stories, right? Like the first image, right? But of course, I always feel compelled to follow up on that by saying, and then you spent 3 years writing it, right? Because ideas are like that, right?
Yeah.
You can have an idea in a second, and then it's the commitment to writing it and the belief in it that this single image is actually worth investing in and worth creating
and
around.
Figuring out which ones you want to spend the next 2, 3, 4 years of your life with.
Yeah.
And I often have what I think is a whole idea, but turns out to only be part of an idea. So Plain Kate didn't really come together till someone suggested a Rusalka, and I looked it up, and I'm like, oh, okay.
The talking cat is a huge character in Plain Kate, and I really understand why all those young readers are drawn to him, to Taggle. And I'd love it if you could read a piece from Plain Kate that, that gives us a little bit of who he is and why he is.
Okay, all right. Let's give him his first word. Let's give him the moment where, so the bad guy, Lene, is a witch, and he has backed Plain Kate into a corner so that she has to trade with him for the goods she needs to survive. She has to flee her town. So she needs like a backpack and some food. But the only thing she has to trade is her shadow. And the other thing to know about this is that magic in this book is an exchange of gifts. So he's going to give her more than just the backpack, but she doesn't appreciate that yet. She chickens out at the last moment and tries to run away. So I'll start from there. "Where are you going?" said Lene. Plain Kate began to babble something, but Lene had risen to his feet silently as a wave. His hand flashed and his wrist flicked. Blood flew and fell over Kate like a net. She leapt back shouting, and Taggle the cat spilled from her arms and howled like a dying thing. And then the air turned to glass. "Stay," said Lene, soft, coaxing into the sudden silence. Kate couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Taggle lay belly flat as if his back were broken. Lene looked at her with his head tilted, smiling softly as a father smiles at a sleeping child. Plain Kate thought she was dying, and that when she died, she would remain as a statue, held in place by the stiffness of the air. Lene reached out a hand for her. She was sure he would die. She would die when he touched her, but she could only watch his hand coming. And then he did touch her. And the air was air again, and Kate crashed and staggered to the deck. The world spun and sparks shot through her vision. Lene loomed over her, dim and white as a pillar. "Well," said the witch, "that's that." "What?" Kate gasped. She coughed and blinked. Taggle shook his head hard, his ears flapping. "I've left your goods around the third big stone at the bend of the road." "But," Plain Kate couldn't stop him. She couldn't even see him. He was a sort of white shadow above her. She lay panting on the wet wood, her hair hanging down over the deck edge towards the river. He looked down at her, his face fuzzy, and she thought he looked genuinely sad. "Loss of a shadow is a slow thing," he said. "You'll have a little time before someone notices. Find a place to belong before that happens." Then he sang, "Go fast, Plain Kate, and travel light. Learn to walk a shadowy night. Without a shadow, flee from light. Become a shadow, truly." "Will you come with me?" he asked. "To the stone city?" "No." She could hardly get the word out. "No," he echoed, "but I will see you again, I think." And he rose and went, leaving her lying helplessly in the dark beside the water. It was a long time before she could sit up, before Taggle could gather himself enough to resume sniffing around the meat pie. Plain Kate leaned forward and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyelids until she saw spots. Something had been taken from her, and though it was supposed to be her shadow, she felt as if it might have been her soul. "What did I do?" she muttered. Over by the meat pie, her cat gave a hiss and a hairball cough. Plain Kate opened her eyes. "Musicians," the cat spat. "Do you know what fiddle strings are made of? I am glad he's gone. Let's eat."
I love how much Taggle has to say about what he's eating, how often he's eating, and how he should be eating much more, because I think those are very, very cat-like concerns. But I think one of the reasons, I would say for me, why he's such a special character is how protective he is of Kate. And we were talking earlier about how alone she is. And as soon as Taggle began speaking, I thought, aha, an ally.
Yeah, just what you need to escape from the witch burning mobs, a talking cat.
Indeed.
He's pretty great.
Yeah. So I'm sure, was he fun to write?
He's so much fun to write. Yeah, my characters mostly are very reserved and very, they don't know what they're feeling. And if they did know, they wouldn't tell you. I mean, they're very Mr. Spock characters. and I'm just looking for that crack. But I've got a handful of them that are just kind of like, I'm going to say what's on my mind, and it's about sausages. He's a hoot. Stand on the Sky started as a book about a boy rewilding a hawk at a nature station in Kansas. And I wrote myself into a corner with that and kind of simmered on it for a long time. And then I saw the images, you may have seen them too because they're fairly famous, from Asher Spendinsky, who's a BBC photojournalist, of the young people training with eagles in Mongolia, right? Yeah. The new generation of eagle hunters. And I went, oh, there's a whole new set of possibilities for a story and an ending that don't exist for technical reasons having to do with falconry in Kansas. You know, I was like, oh, there it is. So I sometimes get my ideas from colliding them with other ideas at high speed, which I suppose is what happens when you get a particle physicist turned novelist. You just bang them together and see what comes out.
Okay, so we're back to Stand on the Sky, and I want to ask about this Originary hawk story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this idea that there was, I'm calling it the Originary hawk, the hawk that first stuck in your imagination.
My hawk.
Yeah.
The boy's hawk. Yeah. I've been obsessed with hawks for a long time. And as far as I can tell, this is the origin story, although origins are always murky. When I was a kid, we lived in the suburbs, no place special, but on a dead-end street next to what Canadians would call a woodlot. I thought it was a forest. There's a little creek running through it. It flooded all the time, so it couldn't be built on, and there were trees and kind of a meadow and deer and foxes and monarch butterflies. And I don't suppose it was very big, but it was, my wildlands. My wild country. And I spent a lot of time just whacking my way through there with a stick and digging the clay up out of the creek bed and making things and capturing gardener snakes and bringing them home in pails to keep for pets, which my mother didn't let me do. Gathering up fox mandibles and bits of bone and just generally being a witchy little child. And one day I was in the woods and I came across a hawk that was hanging from the tree upside down by its jesses, by the little leashes attached to its wrists. Do they have wrists? Yeah, a tame hawk, a falconer's hawk, tangled up in a tree and hanging upside down and thrashing around. And it was so violent. They're so much bigger than you think they are when they're right at your eye level. And it was desperate. It was thrashing about, and then it would just hang there like it was dead. And I was, fascinated, but also panic-stricken, but also how do you rescue the hawk without getting killed? And then the falconer came along and untangled the hawk and, fed it something and stroked it and calmed it down and then launched it again. And, he might as well have been King Arthur. I mean, yeah, so then I was like, okay, my entire life now is going to be about falconry. I went through a major falconry phase as a young person. I read T.H. White's The Goshawk and have some argument with that. I mean, part of this book is an argument with that book. All these books about falconry and then the Kazakh eagle dreams about going to Mongolia and all these, everything I could find. I love My Side of the Mountain. Does anyone remember that one?
Yes, that was a huge favorite for me. And this is my gender story about My Side of the Mountain. Somehow I missed that it was a boy.
Oh.
And I thought My Side of the Mountain, the narrator was a girl. Sure. Right?
Sure, because she was you.
Because she was me, and I was just waiting for my chance to move away from my suburban home and live in a hollowed out oak.
Absolutely.
I was a little crushed when I got a little older and realized it wasn't going to happen. I thought it was my destiny.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yes, My Side of the Mountain.
Yeah. So yeah, it goes way back. I loved animal stories when I was a kid. I liked My Side of the Mountain, and Where the Red Fern Grows, and all these terrible books in which the animal dies, you know, The Yearling and Bambi and, you know.
Sounder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Part of my reason for writing Stand on the Sky is to write an animal book in which the animal lives. And I just say that up front. I suppose technically it's a spoiler, but the book with an animal and a sticker, children are rightly suspicious.
Yeah.
Right. There's a dog and a sticker on the cover of the book. That dog is going down, man.
It's terrible, but true. Okay, I have some more writerly questions for you that might come back to the books. And in fact, I am going to ask about all the study guides to Plain Kate. I went online and there's like 20 of those things, right? I
haven't read them all.
Well, you know, and there are varying degrees of rigor, right? Yeah. Some ask some fairly tough questions about what it means to be persecuted or to persecute, and some are sort of just reading comprehension guides. But I'm curious about the phenomenon of the study guide from the writer's point of view. What is it like to have your book positioned as something that is going to be a point of inquiry to not one person, but to whole groups of people?
It's very strange. It's like someone gave you a decoder ring and you didn't realize you'd written a code. And like, you didn't mean to write a code. It's just meant to be a story. It's meant to be, I mean, of course, stories always say more than you think they do. And of course they have deeper meaning, and, you know, and they act as launching points for conversations, which is good. And it's good to have guides for those conversations in like a classroom setting. But sometimes people are like, you know, why did the author include the wood carvers in the, and I'm like, author doesn't know.
Well, you know, the idea that a book is something that the reader and the writer write together, yes. I think is something that I talk about a lot, you know, in the classroom. And sometimes I say what I think is amounts to what some of my students think is heresy, is that the author isn't always going to reveal to you why something happens. A, because sometimes they don't know, or B, because they know, but they want you to think about it. You know, they want the reader to decide for themselves.
Yeah, and in an important sense, their books belong to their readers, not to the authors. You know, so people write to me, not mostly about Plain Kate, although sometimes it's like, what happens to them next? But mostly about my science fiction universe and the Scorpion rules, and they ask specific questions about specific characters that they want to know more about. I'm like, well, this is what's in my research files, but it's not in the text. You can imagine whatever it is that you want to imagine, you know, fan fiction writers, to your posts, and please share when you're done, because I would love to see what you come up with. It's, I think you're right. It is a joint enterprise. It's something of a miracle that I can put on this paper just a series of figures and create a character, get halfway there. And then you can go into this book with this series of little magic signals and pull that character out. And together we create this thing, this living, breathing person who, I mean, my books are well known for making people cry. People cry over these fictional people. You know, they seem very real. They seem very real to me. And I think they seem very real to many readers. I hope they do. And that's so weird. It's such a deep piece of magic. It doesn't make any sense that it should work, but it does.
But it does over and over again too. I mean, that's the incredible thing, right? It's that there's, you know, you're the author of many books. And so do you ever sit down and think, I don't know if I've got it in me one more time?
Oh, sure. Those are days. Yeah. It's like, this one is stuck. It's never going anywhere. I've been faking it for 7 books and clearly I'm done now. Yeah.
Are you thinking it now about your current project?
Right now I'm editing. I'm sorry, something is beeping and I don't know what. I thought I have everything turned off.
Don't worry, beeps are part of everyday life now.
Part of everyday life. Right now, I've just finished writing one book. It's kind of out for sale, so it's meeting the world for the very first time. And the other one I'm editing. And so I'm sending it out to like very early readers, fellow authors for the very first time. And in neither case do I have a blank page staring at me. So right now, no. Right now I'm like, are these any good, or should I just, go and change my name and live in the woods before anyone finds out that I wrote them? But I'm not feeling like I will never write again, because that's not where I am right now. But often I feel that way, quite often. I think self-doubt is just part of the game.
Can you say anything about how the pandemic has or has not affected your process?
The pandemic's been tough at our house. My kids are 14. My older kid turned 15 during the pandemic, and 12. Neither one of them are in school. So we have we have care for elderly people, so we just need to keep our household closed up. Neither one of them found distance education very useful, so we're trying to homeschool them. I have a job that I used to do in a different building and keep sort of mentally separate, and now I do in this space. And yeah, everything just kind of piled into one place. It's been a long year. I think it's been a long year for a lot of creative people. Writing is, for me, sort of, until you get the door open and share it with people, it's an intensely solitary thing. You sort of spend a lot of time very quietly. I'm in my garden shed right now, so it's very quiet, talking to fictional people. And when I can't get that solitude, it's difficult. It's really difficult.
Yeah, indeed. I remember clearly at the beginning of pandemic restrictions, there was that thing running around online about how Shakespeare had written King Lear in when he was isolated for the pandemic, for the bubonic plague.
The LA Times was predicting like this surge in new book, like people submitting books to agents and publishers in 9 months' time. I'm like, oh, go away, LA Times.
Yeah, I thought the same.
Survive here, right?
Yeah. I'm pretty much occupied with washing down my groceries and getting masks, right?
Right.
Okay, I want to switch a little bit here and ask you to talk a little bit about poetry.
Fun. Okay.
And the writing of poetry. This is how I first read you, as Erin Noteboom, when you won the CBC Poetry Contest a number of years ago now.
Yeah.
And so I've always thought of you as a poet first, which is that accurate?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I wrote poetry first. I still write poetry. I don't work on it every day, but I work on it a lot. It's sort of always at the back of my thoughts. I read a lot of poetry. It does not pay the bills.
No.
And it does not come with the sort of pressure-filled deadlines of fiction. So I've been turning out fiction in a little bit faster way. But yeah, I think of myself, I usually describe myself as a poet and a novelist. So yeah.
And I'm interested too, not only in thinking about how your poetic practice sits alongside the practice of writing prose, but also how your training in the sciences shows up in each of those. And I'm most familiar with your poems that do have to do with the sciences. I just read Curie and Love, about rattle, which I loved. And maybe you'll read that for us.
Find that for you. Sure.
Okay. And also, I remember you and I were both in a special issue of the New Quarterly for the and the New Quarterly and the Quark issue, right? And of course, I'm not a scientist, and I was just fooling around a little bit with the sestina and the quark, but you are a scientist. And
well, calling me a scientist is like calling a kid who dropped out of med school a doctor. So I come with a certain scientific frame of mind, but I've never actually like done research to generate new knowledge in the world. And since I work at Perimeter as a science writer with actual scientists, I feel obliged to say that what they do
draw
is
that
different
distinction.
than what I do. Yeah. But yeah, I trained as a particle physicist. I'm really interested. I've always been interested in physics. I still am. It's part of my day-to-day life because I've been writing right now about gluon scattering, about the scattering of the particles that stick stuff together, which are literally called gluons because that's how physicists roll and how they bounce off each other. So, you know, there's new results in this field. So I'm writing about that. I do that for my day job.
Okay, I want to ask you the question about the poetic practice again.
All
so
right. Try that one more time, sorry.
It's all right. So we were talking about science, and we were talking about the poetic practice as it appears, the scientific practice as it appears in your poetic practice, and of course, what all this might have to do with writing prose. So I'm interested in that kind of triangle, right? The two genres and the interest in science.
I think what they have in common, they have several things in common from my point of view, but here's a good one. They have in common that they reward this kind of really deep attention to the world, this sort of long, slow, kind of difficult attention to the world. You know, reading a book is one thing, and working out a set of physics problems in your high school textbook is one thing, and that's fine. Developing the theory of physics to work out this, that's a whole different, and writing that book, that's a whole different thing, you know? So it's working down underneath the layers of what people experience to create, you know, particularly with poetry. I used to think that my favorite thing about science is discovering these, well, I never discovered one, but understanding these really surprising connections, which in science are usually put in the form of equation. So force is change, F equals ma, force is change, or energy is matter. That's the same thing as metaphor, right?
Right.
We could say love is grief. And to work out exactly where that connection is and like embody it in one puzzle of a poem. I don't like poems that need decoder rings, but in one durable way of saying something, you know, that the wind in the green wheat makes the sound of a scythe being sharpened. You know, something about time and change and mortality. And, you know, I love metaphor, and poetry gives it to me purely the way physics equations do.
That's great. I love that. Will you read Curie and Love for us? So
this is Curie and Love. The things that sound as if they are direct quotations actually are direct quotations. They're from her journals and notebooks. And the poem has an epigram from her doctoral dissertation. If a radioactive substance is placed in the dark in the vicinity of a closed eye or of the temple, a sensation of light fills the eye. Marie Curie, doctoral dissertation, 1903. The sensation of light is light. There is no way for her to know it. She is so young and so in love, choosing for her wedding gown a navy dress suitable for use in laboratories. Hand in hand, they slip through the university courtyard, Pierre and Marie Curie, in the world before the war. One of our joys was to go into our workroom at night, she wrote, to perceive on all sides the feebly luminous silhouettes of the bottles and capsules of our work. That light marbles and embarnacles them both, turns their fingers strange and fibrous. Soon enough, he cannot rise from bed. It was really a lovely sight and always new to us. She loses 20 pounds, 2 pregnancies. There is no way for her to know that light will soon paint gun sights on the dials of watches, that it is ticking through her body, his body, faster than time. What she has understood is astonishing enough. The atom, active. It is as if marbles were found to be breathing out, as if stones were found to speak. Sick and stumbling, Pierre is struck down by a cart of military equipage. He passes untouched under the hooves of 6 horses, untouched between the front wheels, between the turns of chance and miracle, before 6 tons and the back wheel open his skull and kill him instantly. Thus closes the deterministic world. Your coffin was closed and I could see you no more. I put my head against it. From the cold contact, something like a calm or intuition came to me. She does not record him speaking. That light, she has no way of knowing. It is ionizing radiation, entering the eye, lighting in the eye gel the way a cooling pool is lit around a great reactor. Her hair was thick then and thickly piled, her fingers smooth, her thighs like marble. She closes her eyes and raises the vial.
Wow. Wow. I look forward to reading this book of poems. I realized I had asked you about what you were writing novel-wise, prose-wise, but I hadn't asked about the poetry, and I'm very glad I did. Mm-hmm. Our time here is starting to draw to a close. So Erin, I just want to thank you for being so willing to come on our first show of Watershed Writers, and to congratulate you again on your productivity and on, well, being a writer in the pandemic. I want to congratulate you on surviving through that, and and know that you're welcome back on this show anytime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tanis. And it's delightful to have a new way to showcase writers in the region. There's so much talent here. So it's lovely just to see your face on Zoom.
Good. Thanks very much.
What do we connect?